welcome back this week. This week we're going to finish up the Teachings for Victory Volume 3. We're on the last Gosha, which is Letter from Teradomari. I'm going to have to go straight through it because we're going to take 2 weeks off because we got a bunch of people traveling. And so we're going to finish Teachings for Victory. And then before I get started, since we'll have 2 weeks off, I hope everybody can go locate a copy of this, because it was brought to my attention, and I agree with the point George made, is that we missed the first 130 pages of this at the very beginning of deciding to record. We started recording in the middle of this book. Not in the middle, actually, after about 25% of it was over. Okay? So to create a complete record of this, we're going to go back and reread up to page like 130, 131. All right? Next time we get back together. All right, and then after that, I will have volume 4 in, and I will also have the extra copies that we need for the Heritage of the Ultimate Law of Life. So let's go ahead and get started reading, since we've got so much to get through tonight. All right, page 206 of volume 1 of the Teachings of Nichiren, or the Writings of Nichiren Daishonin. Again, letter from Teradomari. I'm going to go read the background first. Background. On the 28th day of the 10th month, 1271, Nichiren Daishonin arrived at Sado Island on... Oh, pardon me, wrong Gosha. One more. Sorry. That was aspiration for the Buddha land. Background, page 210. After his unsuccessful attempt to execute Nichiren Daishonin at Tatsunokuchi, on the 12th day of the 9th month, 1271, Heino Seima, deputy chief of the Office of the Military and Police Affairs, had no choice other than to follow the government's original instructions to deliver the Daishonin into the custody of Homa Rakuro Seimon Shigetsura, the deputy constable of Sado. The Daishonin was confined for nearly a month at Homa's residence in Aichi, Sagami province, awaiting word of his fate from the government. On the 10th day of the 10th month, Nichiren Daishonin left Aichi, escorted by Homa's warriors. When the group reached the coast of the Sea of Japan on the 21st, snow covered the ground, and the sea was very rough. They were forced to stop for several days at a harbor called Teradomari in Ichigo, and wait for the winds to abate before crossing to Sado Island. Teradomari is said to have prospered from the early 9th century on as a port for shipping traffic between the island of Sado and the Japanese mainland. The day after arriving at Teradomari, the Daishonin wrote this letter and entrusted it to the lay priest whom Toki Jonin had sent to accompany him. The community of believers in Kamakura had been badly shaken by the events of the Tatsunokuchi persecution and the Sado exile, and many among the Daishonin's disciples and lay supporters succumbed to government pressures and gave up their faith, or began to have doubts when they saw the Daishonin persecuted. In order to help his followers dispel their doubts and persevere in faith, the Daishonin, during his exile, produced a number of writings. This letter is the first of these writings, which include the Opening of the Eyes, Letter from Sado, and On Practicing the Buddha's Teachings. At the beginning of this letter, the Daishonin mentions in passing the hardships and difficulties he experienced during the 12-day journey to Teradomari, and then quotes scriptural passages to show that in the latter day of the law, hatred and jealousy of the Lotus Sutra will be worse than during the Buddha's lifetime. He himself is actually confronting such opposition, he says. Next, citing Tentai's view of the Nirvana Sutra as precious jewels to redeem the life of the lotus, the Daishonin declares the superiority of the lotus over the other sutras, all other sutras, and points out the mistaken views of the scholars of the various schools who fail to recognize this. In particular, he mentions the erroneous opinions of the True Word school deriving from Shanmue and others. He warns that the followers of the various schools are committing the offense of slandering the Lotus Sutra, unaware that their patriarchs inwardly concurred with the teachings of the Tentai school, which are based on the Lotus Sutra. The Daishonin next enumerates 4 frequent criticisms of his method of propagation, raised not only by his enemies but by some of his followers as well, and declares that the hardships he has encountered perfectly match the prophecies of the encouraging devotion chapter of the Lotus Sutra. In light of the sutra, he makes clear that he himself is the votary who propagates the sutra in the latter day of the law. So going back to page 206, letter from Teradomari. I think I've been mispronouncing it all these years. Teradomari, starts on page 206. I have received the string of coins that you have sent. Those resolved to seek the way should gather and listen to the contents of this letter. So what's he saying there right from the very beginning? I'm about to reveal some significant things here. This isn't just to an individual. This is part of my teaching. All right? Mm-hmm. So he says, this month, the 10th month, on the 10th day, we left the village of Echi in Aiko district in the province of Sagami. Along the way, we stopped at Kumegawa in the province of Muashi, and after traveling for 12 days, arrived here at the harbor of Teradomari in the province of Echigo. From here, we are going to cross the sea to the island province of Sato, but at the moment the winds are not favorable, so I do not know when we will depart. The hardships along the way were worse than I could have imagined, and indeed more than I can put down in writing. I will leave you to surmise what I endured, but I have been prepared for such difficulties from the outset, so there is no point in starting to complain about them now. I shall accordingly say no more of the matter. So what did he just say in that paragraph? As difficult as this is, I'm not going to be a victim. Okay, I'm not a victim. I'm a votary of the Lotus Sutra. I anticipate this difficulty. I'm not surprised by it. I'm not swayed by it, and neither should you be, is what he's saying. The 4th volume of the Lotus Sutra states, since hatred and jealousy toward this sutra abound even when the thus come one is in the world, how much more will this be so after his passing? The 5th volume says it will face much hostility in the world and be difficult to believe. And the 38th volume of the Nirvana Sutra states, at that time, all the non-Buddhists spoke to King Ajatasattu saying, O great king, at present there is a man of incomparable wickedness, a monk called Gautama. All sorts of evil people hoping to gain profit and alms have flocked to him and become his followers. These people do not practice goodness, but instead use the power of spells and magic to win over men like Mahakashayapa, Shariputra, and Madhyayana. Who's Gautama? Gautama.
Is Buddha?
That's Shakyamuni Buddha, right.
Buddha, yeah.
This passage from the Nirvana Sutra recounts the evil words that the various non-Buddhists spoke against Shakyamuni Buddha because he refuted the scriptures preached by their original teachers, the 2 deities and the 3 ascetics. In the above passage from the Lotus Sutra, however, it is not the Buddha himself who is being looked upon as an enemy. Rather, as Tentai explains, it is the Lotus Sutra that is being opposed by the various voice hearers and cause awakened ones, and the bodhisattvas who seek only the Buddha of recent enlightenment. In other words, by the way, the Buddha of recent enlightenment, that's Shakyamuni in India, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, persons who show no desire to hear or believe in the Lotus Sutra, or who say that it does not match their capacity, though they may not actually slander it in so many words, are all to be regarded as persons of hatred and jealousy. Observing the situation when the Buddha was in the world and comparing it with the situation since his passing, we may say that the scholars of the various schools in the world today are like the non-Buddhists of the Buddha's time. They, too, speak of a man of incomparable wickedness, by which they mean me, Nichiren. They speak of all sorts of evil people who have flocked to him, by which they mean my disciples and followers. The non-Buddhists, having incorrectly received and transmitted the teachings of the earlier Buddhas, displayed hostility toward the latter Buddha, Shakyamuni. The scholars of the various schools today are just the same. In effect, they have let their own way of understanding the Buddhist teachings lead them into erroneous views. They are like persons who, dizzy from drink, think that the huge mountain in front of them is spinning round and round. And so we now have these 8 schools or 10 schools all disputing with one another over the various doctrines. The 18th volume of the Nirvana Sutra sets forth the doctrine of the precious jewels that redeem life. The great teacher, Tentai, after studying and pondering this passage, concluded that life refers to the Lotus Sutra and the precious jewels to the first 3 of the 4 teachings expounded in the Nirvana Sutra. But what then of the 4th the perfect teaching, which the Nirvana Sutra also expounds? This teaching represents a reiteration of the doctrine already expounded in the Lotus Sutra concerning the eternally inherent Buddha nature. and was preached to lead people to the Lotus Sutra from which it originated. Do you understand? Do you understand what he's saying there? He says the merit of the Nirvana Sutra is really the perfect teaching of the Nirvana Sutra is the Lotus Sutra. All right? So he's saying, pardon me, this teaching represents a reiteration of the doctrine already expounded in the Lotus Sutra concerning the eternally inherent Buddha nature, and was preached to lead people to the Lotus Sutra from which it originated. The Nirvana Sutra's perfect teaching of the eternally inherent Buddha nature, in fact, belongs to the Lotus Sutra. The merits unique to the Nirvana Sutra are consequently limited to the first 3 of the 4 teachings. Everybody's with me? He's saying that's why we don't pay that much attention to the Nirvana Sutra, even though it's part of the perfect teaching. Do you understand? Okay. The 3rd volume of Tentai's Profound Meaning of the Lotus Sutra states the Nirvana Sutra offers precious jewels to redeem the life of the Lotus Sutra, and thus the hands are clapped and the bargain concluded. The 3rd volume of the Annotations on the Profound Meaning of the Lotus Sutra explains this by saying, the Tentai school cites this metaphor to indicate that the contents of the Nirvana Sutra are to be regarded as precious jewels. Okay, does everybody understand what he's kind of saying, what he's talking about here when he's talking about precious jewels versus the Lotus Sutra? In other words, they're almost at the level, but they're not anything that compares to the Lotus Sutra. That's what he's qualifying, because there are schools that are saying that the Nirvana Sutra is the highest teaching. Okay, so what he's doing right now is he's refuting that concept. He's saying, no, Tentai says, and I agree, that those are just representative. Okay? So he says, the Tentai school cites this metaphor to indicate that the contents of the Nirvana Sutra are to be regarded as precious jewels. The great teacher Tentai, in his work entitled The Four Meditations, cites the passage in the Lotus Sutra that reads, though they, the Buddhists, point out various different paths and declares that the 4 flavors of the teachings are also to be regarded as precious jewels. If so, then the sutras that were preached before and after the Lotus Sutra are all to be regarded as precious jewels offered for the sake of the Lotus Sutra, the supreme teaching. Do you understand? They're all expedients to help people engage and develop a relationship with the Lotus, which will last eternally. But the Buddhist scholars in the world today are of the opinion that this interpretation represents a doctrine put forward by the Tentai school alone, and that none of the other schools accepts it. When I consider the matter, however, I have this to say. This is his refutation of that concept. The 8 or 10 schools we are speaking of all came into existence after the passing of the Buddha and are the creation of the various scholars and teachers of the time. But we should not evaluate the sutras that the Buddha preached during his lifetime on the basis of the doctrines of schools established after his passing. The judgment put forward by Tentai, however, the judgments, plural, put forward by Tentai, however, completely accord with the teachings of all the sutras. It is wrong to discard them on the grounds that they represent no more than the opinions of a single school. The scholars of the various schools continue to cling to the mistaken opinions of their respective teachers. Therefore, they declare that the Buddhist practices must be accommodated to the people's capacities, or they defer to the opinions of their founders and try to persuade the worthy rulers of the time to be their allies. The upshot of all this is that in the end they give themselves up wholly to evil intentions, engage in wrangling and doctrinal disputes, and take delight in inflicting injury upon people who are guilty of no fault. Among the various schools, everybody's with me, right? Everybody's sticking up for what they believe in, what their teachers taught them. All right? They're not listening so much to what Shakyamuni actually said over the course of his lifetime. And that's the whole point that Daishonin is making here, right? Among the various schools, the opinions of the True Word school are particularly distorted. Its founders, Shanlu Wei and Qingkang Qi, maintained the concept of 3,000 realms in a single moment of life is the most important of all of Tentai's principles and the heart and core of the teachings put forward by the Buddha in the course of his lifetime. But setting aside this doctrine that the 3,000 realms are encompassed by the mind, which constitutes the foundation of both the exoteric and esoteric teachings, the mudras and mantras form the most crucial part of the Buddhist teachings. The teachers of the True Word School in later times have used this pronouncement as a pretext to declare that all sutras that do not mention mudras and mantras are to be regarded as inferior, and in fact, as no different from non-Buddhist teachings. Everybody understands what he said there, right? He's saying that the true word interpretation is the one that's the most wrong because they're saying that the Mahavrachana Sutra is greater than the Lotus Sutra, and it's not even from the wisdom period. All right? Everybody's with me, right? Mm-hmm. Some of the esoteric teachings assert that the Mahavrachana Sutra was preached by the thus come one Mahavrachana, a Buddha other than the thus come one Shakyamuni. Others declare that it is the highest of all the teachings put forth by the Lord of Teachings, Shakyamuni Buddha, while still others say that the same Buddha manifested himself once in the form of Shakyamuni Buddha to preach the exoteric sutras, and on the other occasion in the form of the thus come one Mahavrachana to preach the esoteric sutras. And everybody knows the difference between exoteric and esoteric, right? Mm. Do you? What are esoteric sutras and what are exoteric sutras? The esoteric sutras are the ones that are preached very openly. Everything's out there for everybody to see. Mm-hmm. The esoteric are the mind-to-mind or special mentor or my shit don't stink, I know something more than you do teachings, okay? Like True Word, with the mudras and the mantras, which are all secret and special to True Word only. That's what he's putting down here. He says, some of the esoteric teachers assert that the Mahavrachana Sutra was, pardon me, I already read that, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, thus, misunderstanding the underlying principles of Buddhism, they produce an endless array of erroneous opinions. They are like a group of people who, unaware of the true color of milk, venture various speculations as to what the color might be, though none are able to surmise it correctly. This is an old parable story. Or they are like the blind men in the parable who try to guess the true shape of the elephant. In this connection, the scholars of the various schools should understand that the Mahavrachana Sutra, if preached before the Lotus Sutra, is on the level with the Flower Garland Sutra, and if preached after the Lotus Sutra, is on the level with the Nirvana Sutra. Nonetheless, still precious jewels, though. That's his point, right? Mm-hmm. Is it not possible that the Lotus Sutra in India contained descriptions of mudras and mantras, but that those who translated the text into Chinese omitted those sections? Kumarajiva calling his version of the Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law. Kumarajiva calling his version the Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law. And is it also not possible that Shanmu Wei added mudras and mantras and called his version the Mahavrachana Sutra? For example, there were other versions of the Lotus Sutra, such as the Lotus Sutra of the Correct Law, the supplemented Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law, the Lotus Sutra, the Lotus Meditation Sutra, and the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra. In India, after the Buddha's passing, Bodhisattva Nagarjuna was the one who truly understood the relationship between the Lotus Sutra and the other sutras, while in China, the great teacher Tentai Chi was the first to grasp it correctly. Men like Shanmu Wei of the True Word School, Chen Quan of the Flower Garland School, Chia Sheng of the Three Treatises Schools, and Su In of the Dharma Characteristic School each publicly upheld the doctrines of the school that they had established. But in their hearts, they were all won over to the teachings of the Tentai school. Yet their disciples were ignorant of this fact and hence developed erroneous opinions. How can they avoid being guilty of slandering the correct teaching, the Lotus Sutra? He's saying it's impossible for them to, right? They're all slanderers. Nichiren does not understand the capacities of the people of the time, but goes around preaching in a harsh manner. Some people criticize me saying, pardon me, excuse me, I messed that up. Missed the first part of the sentence. Again. Some people criticize me saying, Nichiren does not understand the capacities of the people of the time, but goes around preaching in a harsh manner. That is why he meets with difficulties. Other people say the practices described in the encouraging devotion chapter are for bodhisattvas who are far advanced in practice. Nichiren ought to follow the practices of the peaceful practices chapter, yet he fails to do so. Others say, I too know the Lotus Sutra is supreme, but I say nothing about it. Still others complain that I give all my attention to doctrinal teachings. I am well aware of all these criticisms against me, but I recall the case of Pian Ho, who had his legs cut off at the knee, and of Kiyomaro, pure man, who was dubbed Kegaramaru, filthy man, and was almost put to death. All the people of the time laughed at them with scorn, but unlike those two men, those who laughed left no good name behind them. And all the people who level unjust criticisms at me will meet with a similar fate. The encouraging devotion chapter says there will be many ignorant people who will curse and speak ill of us. I observe my own situation in this passage. Why should it not apply to all of you as well? They will attack us with swords and staves. The passage continues. I have experienced this passage from the sutra with my own body. Why do you, my disciples, not likewise? Further on, the passage says, in the midst of the great assembly, they constantly try to defame us, and they will address the high rulers, high ministers, brahmas, and householders, slandering and speaking evil of us. And they will confront us with foul language and angry frowns. Again and again we will be banished. Again and again means time after time. And I, Nichiren, have been repeatedly driven away and have twice been condemned to exile. Everybody's with me, right? He was talking about the encouraging devotion chapter before that. The Lotus Sutra accords with the fashion of the preaching employed by all Buddhas of the three existences. The past events described in the Never Disparaging chapter I am now experiencing as predicted in the Encouraging Devotion chapter. Thus, the present foretold in the Encouraging Devotion chapter corresponds to the past of the Never Disparaging chapter. The Encouraging Devotion chapter of the present will be the Never Disparaging chapter of the future, and at that time, I, Nichiren, will be its Bodhisattva Never Disparaging. The Lotus Sutra consists of a single work in 8 volumes and 28 chapters. But I have heard that the sutra, as it existed in India, was long enough to stretch over a whole yojana. In other words, there must have been many more chapters to it. The 28-chapter version used today in China and Japan represents the most essential portion of an abbreviated version. He says, Kumarajiva, clean this confusing thing up. Let us set aside for now. But again, it's that version that was used by Nagarjuna and Tiantai and Miolo and Dengyo and everybody else that came along. Do you understand that? All right? So he's saying, in other words, there must have been many more chapters to it. The 28-chapter version used today in China and Japan represents the most essential portion of an abbreviated version. Let us set aside for now the revelation section of the sutra. In the following transmission section, the 3 pronouncements of the Treasure Tower chapter are delivered to the assembly gathered at Eagle Peak and present at the ceremony in the air. As to the vow made in the encouraging devotion chapter by the 28,000, 80,000, and 800,000 million Nayutas of graded bodhisattvas, a man of shallow wisdom like myself cannot comprehend it. But the phrase, in an age of fear and evil, that appears in this chapter nevertheless indicates the beginning of the latter day of the law. The following peaceful practices chapter refers to this age of fear and evil with the words in the latter age. And looking at the translations, looking at other translations of the sutra, we find that in the Lotus Sutra of the correct law, it appears as in the latter age hereafter, or in the latter age to come. While in the supplemented Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law, it appears as in an age of fear and evil. In this latter age, which corresponds to our own time, which is Mappo, the 3 types of enemies have appeared, but not a single one of the 800,000 million Nayutas of Bodhisattvas is anywhere to be seen. It is like a lake that is dried and is missing its full share of water, or a waning moon that is far from full. If the water is clear, it will reflect the moon's image, and if the trees are planted, then birds can nest in them. Therefore, I, Nichiren, propagate this sutra in place of the 800,000 million Nayudas of Bodhisattvas. I ask that these Bodhisattvas grant me their aid and protection. The lay priest who bears this letter tells me that you instructed him to accompany me to the province of Sado. But in view of the expenses of the trip and other difficulties, I am sending him back to you, Toki Jonin. I already know the depths of your consideration. Please explain to the others what I have written here. I am very much concerned about the priests who are in prison, and I hope you will inform me of their situation at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, Nichiren, the hour of the cock, the 22nd day of the 10th month. Not too far from where we are right now. So, then, going on to the lecture by President Ikeda, that comes in volume 3, page 131 of Teachings for Victory. We won't read the gray boxes because we already just read the whole Gosho. We'll start on page 134. Everybody's with me?
Yeah.
I think I can pull this off. All right. What is the noblest way of life? President Ikeda asks. My unhesitating answer is a life dedicated to truth and justice. Only in a world where truth and justice flourish can people freely bring forth their innate goodness. If, in contrast, belief systems that deny the possibility of infinite human improvement prevail, misery and suffering will abound. When society and the times are in turmoil, the noblest and most honorable life is one committed to speaking out boldly for what is right. What did he say there? Don't be afraid. Don't be defeated. Faith, victory of gold. Okay? If you chant sincerely to the Gohonzon to fulfill your mission as a bodhisattva of the earth, you will always know what that means. And you will always be on the course to accomplish that. It's really up to you and your relationship with the Gohonzon. It's really not as much about what you might read or who might encourage you. It's really about you and your original state. Always understand that. You are the Buddha exactly as you are. A famous English poet said, "Hold by the right, you double your might." I have made these words one of my mottos, engraving them in my heart in my youth and putting them into practice. Whenever I was buffeted by the raging waves and tempests of adversity, I held fast to what was right, to truth and justice, doubling my strength and triumphing over all. As practitioners of Nichiren Buddhism, we uphold the supreme teaching of the mystic law and work to transform the karma of the entire human race. Kozen Rufu is a great struggle in which we live in accord with the truth of the correct Buddhist teaching. When we stand up to realize the lofty ideal of helping people awaken to their inherent Buddhahood, the individual power and strength of each one of us can multiply tenfold, 100-fold. Throughout his noble life, Nichiren championed the Lotus Sutra's teaching that all people have the potential for attaining Buddhahood. He strove tirelessly to clarify the correct teaching and to refute the erroneous doctrines of the established Buddhist schools, which distorted Buddhism's original spirit. This was equally true during his stay in the port of Teradomari, awaiting the favorable winds that would carry him to his place of exile across the water, Sado Island. So what did he basically qualify there again in that first sentence? Throughout his life, Nichiren championed the Lotus Sutra's teaching that all people have the potential for attaining Buddhahood. What is that potential? Is it to find Buddhahood? Is it to create Buddhahood? No, it's to awaken Buddhahood that already exists. All right? Truth and justice will prevail. Watch my dauntless struggle. This is Nichiren's message. Letter from Teradomari constitutes a spirited counterattack, a fresh offensive in Nichiren's struggle. He seeks to communicate to his disciples, many of whom were shaken and disturbed by the storm of persecution that had descended, that he, with the spirit of a Lion King, is determined to launch a bold struggle of words to clarify the correct teaching, refusing to retreat a single step in the face of persecution. So before we go on, let's recap. Where is this all coming from? This letter that's just been written. What's preceded it in terms of activity, in terms of reality? Tatsunokuchi just happened. He just spent a month realizing I didn't get my head cut off. Who knows what kind of daimoku? He knows he's going to Sado Island, or maybe he won't. He really doesn't know until they actually send it. Maybe they'll commute this mistake of exile to Sado, and he won't have to go. He doesn't really know what's going to happen until he gets to Teradomari and knows, okay, I'm really definitely going to Sado Island. Right? Do understand that, because there was a lot of confusion after Tatsunokuchi, because the people that took him to Tatsunokuchi didn't even want to deal with him. They were scared of him. Right? He had frightened them with what had occurred, with him telling them, you're not going to pull this off. You're not going to pull this off. All right? So do understand that this is a time when he's had a chance to actually review himself for about a month to understand what's coming up, what he's got to do when he gets to Sado Island. What's he got to do when he gets to Sado Island? He has to survive, number one. Okay? Number one, first and foremost, he has to survive. He has to win, but also he must not lose any of the disciples of the people that he must be the example. He must have victory. All right? So he already understands what he's going to have to do. That's why when he gets to Sado Island, what's he going to do? He's going to write the opening of the eyes. He's going to write the object of devotion for observing the mind. He's going to write major corrective theses about his Buddhism of the sowing versus Buddhism of the harvest. He's going to qualify it as the Buddhism of the sowing for the first time.
Yeah.
Okay? So this is all, he already knows this is all coming up. And he's got great conviction that he's going to pull it off. Now what's he got to base his conviction on?
So good.
Nothing! Nothing but faith. And the fact that his life is absolutely corresponding to the teaching that's already been laid out in the Lotus Sutra. So he's not freaked out about the shit hitting the fan.
Right.
Lotus Sutra already said the shit's going to hit the fan for the votary. All right? So he's going, bring it on, dudes. I'm doing my thing. I'm showing you how to be the Buddha too. You got to have that same conviction. My life and your life are the same kind of life. I'm not special. All right? So, go through page 135. Again, when you read Nichiren Daishonin, he's telling you the attitude you should live your life with. Not just him as the true Buddha. You are a true Buddha as well. Right? There is no separation between the original teacher and the original disciples. Zero. They don't exist outside of one another. Without the original teacher, there are no original disciples. Without original disciples, there is no original teacher. Do you understand? Nam-myoho Renge-kyo encompasses both of them equally. Equally. That's the teaching of Nichiren. There's no separation between him and you. You are just as much a Buddha as he is. If you figure that out and do the things that he did that reveal that to be the truth rather than something theoretical or happy talk. Do you understand? So, when this shit hits the fan, what do we all do then? We should smile and chant Daimoku. No. That's really what we should do. We should smile and chant Daimoku. Because we know we are being the Buddha through our actions. Regardless of what anyone else thinks. Nichiren's already qualified what that action is. All right? Trust him. I do. All right, so, going on. A trek through bitter cold on page 135, middle of the first column. This month, the 10th month, it's going back to the Gosho. On the 10th day, we left the village of Echi in Aiko district in the province of Sagami. Along the way, we stopped at Kumagawa in the province of Muashi, and after traveling for 12 days, arrived here at the harbor of Teradomari in the province of Echigo. Here we are going to cross the sea to the island province of Sado, but at the moment the winds are not favorable, so I do not know when we will depart. The hardships along the way were worse than I could have imagined, and indeed more than I can put down in writing. I will leave you to surmise what I endured, but I have been prepared for such difficulties from the outset, so there is no point in starting to complain about them now. I shall accordingly say no more of the matter. For about a month immediately after the Tatsunokuchi persecution of September 12, 1271, Nichiren Daishonin was held at the residence of the Deputy Constable of Sado, Homa Rakuro Seiman, in Echi, Sagami Province. He finally left there on October 10th, and after a 12-day journey, which also took him through Kumagawa in Musashi Province, arrived at the harbor of Teradomari in Echigo Province. Although Sado Island lay only a short distance from Teradomari, Nichiren and those accompanying him were forced to wait there for several days for more favorable winds before making the crossing. Letter from Teradomari was written on October 22nd and is addressed to Toki Jonin, one of Nichiren's leading lay followers. In the old lunar calendar in use during Nichiren's lifetime, October, or the 10th month, is the equivalent of the latter half of November and early December by our modern calendar, the end of autumn. We can imagine Nichiren trudging through the bitter cold and biting winds, each step taking him deeper into Japan's North Country. It was a journey to an exile that would bring even more intense hardship and persecution. In letter from Teradomari, he writes, I have been prepared for such difficulties from the outset, so there is no point in starting to complain about them now. No matter how daunting the trials and difficulties he personally faced, Nichiren always remained calm. Doubtless, his thoughts were constantly on his followers who were suffering hardships as a result of being persecuted for their beliefs as followers of Nichiren. At the end of the letter, he writes that he is sending back the lay priest whom Toki Jonin had dispatched to accompany him to Sado. He then asked Toki Jonin, please explain to the others what I have written here. In writing this letter immediately after arriving at Teradomari, we can see his eagerness not to lose a moment in writing to encourage his followers, a sign of his great compassion. Next, page 136 from the Gosho, the persecutions encountered by practitioners of the Lotus Sutra. That would be us too, by the way, right? The fourth volume of the Lotus Sutra states, since hatred and jealousy toward this sutra abound even when the thus come one is in the world, how much more will this be so after his passing? The fifth volume says it will face much hostility in the world and be difficult to believe. And the 38th volume of the Nirvana Sutra states, at that time all the non-Buddhists spoke to King Ajatasattu, saying, O great king, at present there is a man of incomparable wickedness, a monk called Gautama. All sorts of evil people hoping to gain profit and alms have flocked to him and become his followers. These people do not practice goodness, but instead use the power of spells and magic to win over men like Mahakashayapa, Shariputra, and Madhvayana. They, the scholars of the various Buddhist schools in Japan today, too speak of a man of incomparable wickedness, by which they mean me, Nichiren. They speak of all sorts of evil people who have flocked to him, by which they mean my disciples and followers. The non-Buddhists, having incorrectly received and transmitted the teachings of the earlier Buddhas, displayed hostility toward the later Buddha, Shakyamuni. The scholars of the various schools today are just the same. In effect, they have all let their own way of understanding the Buddhist teachings lead them into erroneous views. They are like persons who, dizzy from drink, think that the huge mountain in front of them is spinning round and round. President Ikeda's lecture going on page 136, second column. To thoroughly dispel the doubts of his followers, who wondered why practitioners of the mystic law should encounter persecution, as many of us do sometimes, Nichiren immediately proceeds to cite from the Lotus Sutra, where it explains why we encounter those difficulties. The first passage is from the Teacher of the Law, the 10th chapter. By the way, these goshos have been hitting these, like 2 goshos ago was Teacher of the Law, last gosho was Treasure Tower, right? Now we're in encouraging devotion. So he says, Teacher of the Law, the 10th chapter, since hatred and jealousy toward the sutra abound even when the thus come one is in the world, how much more will this be so after his passing? The second passage is from the Peaceful Practices, the 14th chapter. It will face much hostility in the world and be difficult to believe. Those who propagate the Lotus Sutra in the latter day of the law, which would be all of us, correct, inevitably meet with opposition. This is just as the sutra itself states. And because Nichiren practiced in exact accord with the sutra's teachings, he was persecuted. And because we endeavor to be of the same mind as Nichiren, so shall we be, possibly, based on what our karmic mission is. Although in his day a great many Buddhist scholars flourished in Japan, no one but Nichiren proclaimed the truth of the Lotus Sutra, its correct meaning, and resolutely denounced slander of the law, the numerous erroneous teachings that brought misery and unhappiness to the people. So what did he equate there? He just snuck that in pretty cleverly. Although in his day a great many Buddhist schools flourished in Japan, no one but Nichiren proclaimed the truth of the Lotus Sutra. What would be the truth of the Lotus Sutra?
That is,
It's the only teaching that's not an expedient means.
yeah.
Okay? It's the only teaching that reveals the truth. Okay? As it relates to this time, the latter day. He says, its correct meaning, which is to perceive it as I just described it, and resolutely denounce slander of the law, the numerous erroneous teachings that brought misery and unhappiness to the people. So what did that hyphen and then clarification, the numerous erroneous teachings that brought misery and unhappiness to the people, qualify? That all of the sutras that were meant as expedient means are now creating slander by being followed now that it's the latter day and the Lotus Sutra has been qualified. Do you understand? He's saying the numerous erroneous teachings, because why are they erroneous? Because it's the latter day of the law and they no longer apply. They were for the former and the middle day, right?
Yes.
But prior to the true Buddha making his advent in the 5th 500-year period, they couldn't appear. They couldn't be correct in that way, right? Okay, so he's saying, continuing, first column, page 137. So all the previous teachings now have taken on a different form. They no longer lead people to enlightenment. They lead people to suffering because they negate the teaching of the lotus, that the lotus is to be upheld only. Get it? All right. Being attached to their own teachings, however, the priests of the existing Buddhist schools reacted with hostility and resentment when Nichiren pointed out their errors. Knowing they stood no chance of beating him in doctrinal debate, they plotted his downfall by spreading false accusations about him. Their smear campaign succeeded in prompting high-ranking officials of the Kamakura military government to act against Nichiren, even though he was innocent of the charges. This ultimately led to such major persecutions as the attempt to behead him at Tatsunokuchi and, when that failed, his exile to Sado Island. And this is a strategy used by people all the time, right? It just happened in America, you know, with basically them saying that something was true that was not true. You know, the investigator of what's going on there, they just caught a bunch of people trying to create a scandal about him being
Sexual harassment.
a sexual predator, which was not true. They got busted. Okay, but that still happens. People try to discredit the person speaking because they cannot defeat the argument being made. Do you understand that? That's similar to what President Ikeda goes through as well, frankly speaking. All right, and you shall too. Nichiren further cites a passage from the Nirvana Sutra describing a common pattern of persecution befalling those who propagate the correct teaching. It tells of non-Buddhist teachers who, when Shakyamuni revealed the error of their Brahmin teachings, maligned him to the ruler King Gajatashatru. There's a man of incomparable wickedness, a man called Gautama. All sorts of evil people have flocked to him. Such criticisms were, of course, completely false and without basis. The same thing said about Daisaku Ikeda today. Shakyamuni had stood up to help free people from the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death. He had practiced arduously and then gone out among the people to teach and guide them to the path for attaining Buddhahood. Nichiren goes on to explain that the reprehensible actions, verbal abuse, and defamations directed against him and his disciples mirror those that befell Shakyamuni. He writes, they, the scholars of the various Buddhist schools in Japan today, too, speak of a man of incomparable wickedness, by which they mean me, Nichiren, and they speak of all sorts of evil people who have flocked to him, by which they mean my disciples and followers. As Nichiren details in another letter, the true word precepts priest Ryokan of Gorakuji, a temple in Kamakura, and his cohorts, trying to hide their own corrupt activities, engineered an outcry against Nichiren. They spread false rumors about him amongst the constables, stewards, and magistrates of each province. For instance, they made allegations to the authorities such as Nichiren and his followers have set fire to and cast into water images of Amida Buddha, and they are your mortal enemy. He further states that Ryokan also instigated local authorities to take action against him and his followers. He urges them to cut off our heads or banish us from our lands. Both the non-Buddhists in Shakyamuni's day and the opponents that harassed Nichiren adopted the same tactics in their intrigues. In every age, pretenders to truth employ baseless accusations and lies to persecute authentic champions of truth. Referring to the priests of the various Buddhist schools, everybody's with me? And you know that's a fact. And it will happen to you if you speak out. There will be people that will oppose what you're saying, and they'll lie about you in order to oppose what you're saying. Period. So don't be surprised when it happens, and don't be angry at them when it happens. Okay? They're actually providing you with the opportunity to validate the truth of what you understand and what you're saying. Referring to the priests of the various Buddhist schools of his day, in letter from Teradomari, Nichiren writes, they have let their own way of understanding the Buddhist teachings lead them into erroneous views. They were totally oblivious to the faulty foundation of their beliefs that arose from an incorrect understanding of the Buddhist teachings. Nichiren deplores their delusion, writing, they are like persons who, dizzy from drink, think that huge mountains in front of them is spinning round and round. Since its founding, the Soka Gakkai has waged an unending struggle against attacks and persecution that perfectly mirror two Lotus Sutra passages. Since hatred and jealousy toward this sutra abound even when the thus come one, the Buddha is in this world, how much more will this be so after his passing? And it will face much hostility in the world and be difficult to believe. I vividly recall my mentor saying, we must never forget these words that Mr. Makaguchi drummed into us, his disciples. Encountering persecution in the form of slander and abuse and intense hatred and jealousy is a badge of honor for practitioners of the Lotus Sutra. Let me read that again. Encountering persecution in the form of slander and abuse and intense hatred and jealousy is a badge of honor for practitioners of the Lotus Sutra. That's why I smile when I hear about it going to me. Okay? Because it doesn't bother me, because I've been dealing with it for a very, very long time, frankly. All right? So when then I read President Toda qualifying, we got to not forget what President Makaguchi taught us, and President Ikeda is making sure we understand that that's still the case, and is saying exactly what you experience with your own life yourself, it gives you a sense of the correctness of what they must be saying, because you already know from your own experience that that's what occurs. Right? So be prepared. He's saying, both Tainasa Buro Makaguchi and Josei Toda, the first two Soka Gakkai presidents, faithfully upheld the correct teaching of the Lotus Sutra, in which that's why he's making all of these comparatives. What Nichiren went through and what the mentors of the Soka Gakkai went through are very similar. They encountered various forms of persecution that culminated in imprisonment for their beliefs by the Japanese militarist authorities during World War II. I, too, was arrested and jailed on trumped-up charges in 1957 and continued to be the target of many subsequent harsh attacks and spurious claims, and he is to this point today. Ask Mark Rogow, okay, what his opinion of Daisaku Ikeda is, and you'll hear all of the slander you want to hear. So the point that I'm making is that what he's emphasizing in this lecture to us is that I knew to be prepared for this in my life and was not fazed by it, and I kicked its ass because my mentor taught me that. And my mentor learned that from his mentor, who was willing to go to prison and die for the correct teaching. Don't forget, Tainasa Buro Makaguchi could have gotten out of prison anytime he wanted to by just saying, no, the priests of Taiseki-ji are cool, and the Shinto talisman is cool, and I was really wrong, and I'm sorry I created all these problems. And if he would have gotten out, Josei Toda would have left with him. And he would have left with him before he attained Buddhahood. Okay? So don't forget why all these things actually happened. They happened because the mystic unfolding of the reality of the people's lives through the conviction of action that they took it upon themselves to convey with their life is the only reason we can see it in this clear rear view mirror that we're talking about it right now. Okay? That rear view mirror, though, is also this no moment, right this second. Do understand that. That's what he was saying a moment ago. The never disparaging chapter is the encouraging devotion chapter of today, and the encouraging devotion chapter is the never disparaging chapter of the future. He's talking about this interrelated cycle of mentor and disciple. We're going to go through this process forever and ever and ever. Each lifetime, we're going to be born into the capacity to receive and perceive the correct teaching. We're going to have a teacher that teaches us that understanding and correct conviction. We're going to then live that and teach it to others in the course of our lifetime. This will never stop. That's called Buddhahood. All right? But we of the Soka Gakkai have triumphed completely over all these obstacles and malicious assaults. Practicing steadfastly in accord with Nichiren's teachings, we have continued to speak out boldly for truth and justice, refusing to be intimidated by plotting and persecution. We have been victorious because we have continued to advance with the indestructible unity of many in body, one in mind. Armed with the spirit of encountering persecution is the highest honor. Is the highest honor because it validates the fact that you're practicing correctly. Initiating a counterattack for the truth and justice. And so, we now have these 8 schools or 10 schools all disputing with one another over the various doctrines. The 18th volume of the Nirvana Sutra sets forth the doctrine of the precious jewels that redeem life. I recall the case of Pianho, this is from the Gosho, pardon me, top of page 139, first column, who had his legs cut off at the knee, and Kiyomaro, pure man, who was dubbed Kegoremaro, filthy man, and almost put to death. All the people of the time laughed at them with scorn, but unlike those two men, those who laughed left no good name behind them, and all the people who level unjust criticisms at me will meet with a similar fate. The latter day of the law is a period of constant quarreling and doctrinal disputes within Buddhism. In Nichiren's time, Japanese Buddhism was divided into 8 or 10 schools, each clinging to their own teaching and disputing with the others. In Letter from Teradomari, Nichiren mentions the doctrine of the precious jewels that redeem life set forth in the Nirvana Sutra, using it to emphasize that we should base ourselves on the sutras that the Buddha preached during his lifetime, not the doctrines created by various schools and teachings after his passing. These so-called redeeming jewels function to support and protect the priceless treasure of life. Nichiren says that life, in the phrase the precious jewels that redeem life, refers to the Lotus Sutra, while precious jewels refers to the sutras preached before and after the Lotus Sutra. In other words, the Lotus Sutra, which reveals the Buddha's wish for the enlightenment of all people and expounds the way for its realization, is the life of Buddhism, while the doctrines taught in all the other sutras, though they may have a certain degree of value, are invalid if they contradict the Lotus Sutra as the highest teaching and the only teaching to be upheld in the latter day. Do you understand? Okay. They're not terrible. It's just that they're no longer in correct alignment with the teachings and the preaching of the Buddha. The priests of the various Buddhist schools at the time, however, ignored the conclusion that based on the entire body of the Buddhist teachings, the Lotus Sutra is the supreme teaching. When Nichiren pointed this out, they clung even more stubbornly to the mistaken opinions of their respective teachers. He writes that, giving themselves up wholly to evil intentions, they engage in wrangling and doctrinal disputes and take delight in inflicting injury upon him and his followers, people who are guilty of no fault. In this letter, Nichiren denounces the actions of the other Buddhist priests of his day who avoided public debate, enjoyed cozy ties with secular authorities, and sought to do away with a person who stood on the side of truth. A possible reason for him introducing the doctrine of the precious jewels that redeem life in this letter may have been to highlight the spirit of the votary who risks his very life to propagate the Lotus Sutra, which is the life of Buddhism. It may also have been to pave the way for the start of Nichiren's full-fledged refutation of the True Word School's fundamental error, and also of the closely connected Tendai esotericism. In other words, Mudra Matra Tentai, distortion. Okay, Mount Hai has been invaded by True Word right now, right? True Word prayers and rites were widely conducted at the time. They were based on an erroneous classification of the Buddhist teachings shared by both the True Word school and Tendai esotericism, and that although the Lotus Sutra and Mahayana Sutra are equal in terms of principle, the latter is superior in practice. Okay? In other words, their foundation was that both sutras were equal because they both contain the doctrine of 3,000 realms in a single moment of life, which constitutes the principle for attaining Buddhahood based on the Lotus Sutra. But 3,000 realms comes from Tentai, doesn't it? Right. But to them, the Mahayana Sutra was superior in practice because it teaches the practice of mudras, mystic hand gestures, and mantras, mystic incantations, whereas the Lotus Sutra does not. Nichiren, however, refuted this, pointing out that the unalterable fact that the Mahayana Sutra belonged to the category of the sutras that were taught either before or after the Lotus Sutra. Therefore, he said it should be regarded as one of the precious jewels that redeemed the life of the Lotus Sutra, with the Lotus Sutra itself recognized as the Buddha's ultimate teaching. At any rate, his full-fledged refutation of the true word teachings began after arriving on Sado and continued through his residence on Mount Minobu. In that sense, Letter from Teradomari can be seen as a prelude. Pardon me. We must remember that at this point, Nichiren was waiting at the harbor of Teradomari to make the crossing to Sado Island and commence his exile there. Despite his circumstances, his impassioned commitment, like a lion king, to refute error and reveal the truth, burned brighter than ever. From this letter, we can get the sense that new horizons are opening for an unprecedented struggle for the sake of Kosarufu. He's had a month to think about what he's got to do when he gets to Sado. And he knows he's definitely going now because he's at the harbor waiting for the ship. All right, they're not going to repeal my sentence. They're not going to bring me back. I'm going to have to go through more crap. All right. There is the feeling that in the midst of raging storms and life-threatening persecution, Nichiren is firmly resolved to redouble his efforts for Kosarufu for the sake of the future. It sure sounds like it from what I read. What led Japan to so disastrously astray? What is the great teaching that should be spread in order to bring true, lasting happiness to the people of Japan, whose very lives and country were imperiled owing to the very real threat of a Mongol invasion? What is Nichiren's role in the propagation of the Lotus Sutra in the latter day of the law? What spirit must one have to qualify as the votary of the Lotus Sutra? These are all things that he's going to qualify while he's on Sado. To answer these and other questions, Nichiren went on to compose important works such as The Opening of the Eyes and the Object of Devotion for Observing the Mind while in exile on Sado. He thereby established the great Buddhist teaching for the enlightenment of all people in the eternal future of the latter day of the law, also known as the Buddhism of sowing. Okay? No matter how, the Buddhism of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. No matter how severely the military government punished him, they were unable to rob him of his lion-hearted fighting spirit. Like they couldn't Makaguchi, like they couldn't Toda, like they can't Ikeda, like they can't you. Okay? All you got to do is be like Mike. Do what they did, which is to follow the example of the Daishonin. Live your life like that. That's all you got to do. You can do it. There's nothing that separates you from being able to do that. You are just as powerful and capable as Nichiren to be able to do that, or you would not be a bodhisattva of the earth charged with the mission to do so in the latter day of the law as his disciple. Do understand that. That's an impossibility then. If you've got the opportunity and the responsibility to do it, it must mean that you can. Okay? Whether he was imprisoned, about to be beheaded, or exiled, they could not shackle the spirit of the Lion King with him. And that Lion King spirit is what President Ikeda is constantly encouraging us to try and capture and to have. It's that sense of invincibility that comes with devout faith. All right? We can see Nichiren attempting to convey to his followers this utterly free and untrammeled life state of the Lion King, calm amid the violent winds and completely composed and reassured that you're going to kick ass, because that's what you do. It's not that there's an obstacle appearing before you. It's that this is another one to add to the list. This is another notch for your gun. All right? Refuting unjust criticisms. In this letter, top of page 141, Nichiren lists 4 criticisms that people leveled against him during his ongoing persecution. 1. Some people criticized me, saying Nichiren does not understand the capacities of the people of the time, but goes around preaching in a harsh manner. That is why he meets with difficulties. 2. Because he did shakabuku. Okay? He didn't say that's okay, and he didn't confront. He did confront. All right? Other people say, number 2, the practices described in the encouraging devotion chapter are for bodhisattvas who are far advanced in practice. Nichiren ought to follow the practices of the peaceful practices chapter, yet he fails to do so. Number 3, others say, I too know the Lotus Sutra is supreme, but say nothing about it. Number 4, still others complain that I give all my attention to doctrinal teachings. Nichiren, however, dismisses the above as unjust criticisms. In this letter, he offers a general refutation of these charges by briefly outlining the way of practice that accords with the Lotus Sutra and the latter day of the law. While refraining from a detailed response here, he later went on to address each of the criticisms at length in the various writings he produced while in exile on Sado Island. For example, in the opening of the eyes, he writes that the methods for both shoju, gentle persuasion, and shakabuku, refuting mistaken views, are to be used in propagating the Lotus Sutra and the latter day of the law. He writes, when the country is full of evil people without wisdom, then shoju is the primary method to be applied, as described in the Peaceful Practices chapter. But at the time when there are many people of perverse views who slander the law, then shakabuku should come first, as described in the Never Disparaging chapter. The latter day of the law is described as an age of quarrels and disputes when the pure law will become obscured and lost, a time when the provisional teachings and the true teaching are all jumbled together. In such an age, the true is seen as erroneous and the erroneous as true. The practice of shakabuku, which clarifies the difference between truth and error, is suited to the time and is the correct method of propagation, which, how did the Kosen Rufa of Japan occur? What was the methodology adopted by the Soka Gakkai from day one? Shakabuku. And why did many people say, oh, Soka Gakkai is so out of control, they're so, this isn't nice? Because of shakabuku, right? Because they would get in people's face and say, no, you're wrong. And this is where you're wrong. And this is why what it says makes you wrong. And knew what to say as the next sentence after that in a refutation. They didn't just have gentle opposition. They actually went about to conquer in debate issues that needed to be surmounted in order to create clarity for the people that were slandering without knowing that they were. All right? It was a tremendous compassion that led them to that kind of practice of shakabuku. All right? Nichiren's efforts in shakabuku can also be seen as a revolution in the very way Buddhism was viewed and practiced, as they aimed to awaken, empower, and unite the people in strong solidarity. In other words, his was a spiritual struggle to establish a religion for the sake of the people, not for the sake of the priesthood or the religious authority that was at the top of it. Religion must contribute to the elevation of the human spirit. It must be a force for developing the inherent goodness within us, with the aim of happiness for all. It must be a force promoting respect, wisdom, and personal empowerment. The alternative is religion that promotes ignorance and subjugation to authority. This is a choice that religion faces today in its role and mission in human society. A humanistic religion cannot be authoritarian. Say it again. A humanistic religion cannot be authoritarian. So when you see authoritarianism, it ain't.
It's not.
It's not a humanistic conveyance of that thought. Nichiren Buddhism, moreover, is a teaching of dialogue, just as you talked about. This is Daisaku Ikeda talking, not you or me. Just remind them what the source of the information is. Nichiren Buddhism, moreover, is a teaching of dialogue, both in terms of doctrine and facts. Nichiren encouraged and cherished dialogue. Greater efforts in interfaith dialogue. Interfaith dialogue. Now Daisaku Ikeda is really going out on a limb. Now he's saying we should have dialogue with people that don't even believe in Buddhism. That's what he's talking about. Get ready for what he's about to say here, because he's taking a lot of shit for saying it. Okay? Greater efforts in interfaith dialogue are essential if we are to overcome the numerous tragic religious conflicts raging in the world today. If we're really going to accomplish Kosen Rufu, it can't just be the club of Nichiren believers. We're going to have to extend our humanity to others in order to influence them. We need fully humanistic religions that can mutually stimulate and encourage one another in contributing to peace. Okay? So we'll inspire those other religions to look more carefully at what their teaching actually teaches. And they will do their own natural human revolution and correspond accordingly to Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. They will eventually get there. This will all be the path. This is the Peaceful Practices chapter being actualized from the Lotus Sutra. That's what he's talking about. All right? Greater efforts in interfaith dialogue are essential if we are to overcome the numerous tragic religious conflicts raging in the world today. We need fully humanistic religions that can mutually stimulate and encourage one another in contributing to peace. The various Buddhist schools during Nichiren's lifetime had lost the true spirit of Buddhism. They denigrated the Lotus Sutra and denied its teaching of the universality of Buddha nature. Nichiren used the power of the written and spoken word to repudiate these schools that turned their back on the Lotus Sutra and rejected the true essence of Buddhism. As noted earlier, the entrenched religious and secular establishments, finding their weaknesses and contradictions exposed in this way, employed every method available to persecute him. In this letter, Nichiren urges his followers not to allow themselves to be disturbed or upset by unfounded criticisms. Don't get all pissed off when it happens, he's saying. He prefaces this message by citing the examples of Pianho and Kiyomaro, two individuals who were persecuted in their lifetimes but are remembered in history as examples of just and righteous men. In this way, Nichiren shows that those who are persecuted and attacked for their commitment to the truth and justice are recognized and lauded in the future when the real facts come out as admirable people of conscience. The names of those who deride and criticize them, however, disappear without a trace, while the names of those who harshly persecute them go down in history as great villains. He's predicting the future for those that have opposed him, frankly. All the people who level unjust criticisms at me will meet with a similar fate, Nichiren says. He proclaims, knowing that history will bear out the truth. His powerful conviction is truly impressive. And he says, it's where I got mine. Rousing the three powerful enemies in the middle of page 142, second column. The encouraging devotion chapter says there will be many ignorant people who will curse and speak ill of us. I observed my own situation in this passage. Why should it not apply to all of you as well? They will attack us with swords and staves, the passage continues. I have experienced this passage from the sutra with my own body. Why do you, my disciples, not do likewise? Further on, the passage says, in the midst of the great assembly, they constantly try to defame us, and they will address the rulers, high ministers, Brahmins, and householders, slandering and speaking evil of us. And they will confront us with foul language and angry frowns. Again and again we will be banished. And again means time after time. And I, Nichiren, have been repeatedly driven away and have twice been condemned to exile. The Lotus Sutra accords with the fashion of the preaching employed by all the Buddhas of the three existences. The past events described in the Never Disparaging chapter I am now experiencing as predicted in the Encouraging Devotion chapter. Thus, the present foretold in the new Encouraging Devotion chapter corresponds to the past of the Never Disparaging chapter. And the Encouraging Devotion chapter of the present will be the Never Disparaging chapter of the future, and at that time, I, Nichiren, will be its Bodhisattva Never Disparaging. Here, Nichiren states that he is practicing according to the Lotus Sutra, reading the sutra with his life. In other words, living its passages. And he strips the masks from his adversaries, revealing their true, fraudulent nature. Encouraging devotion, the 13th chapter of the Lotus Sutra states that the three powerful enemies, arrogant lay people, arrogant priests, and arrogant false sages, will arise to attack the devotee who propagates the Lotus Sutra in the evil latter age after the Buddha's passing. The three powerful enemies are described in the famous 20-line verse section that closes the Encouraging Devotion chapter. In this part of Letter from Teradomari, Nichiren cites passages from that verse section and confirms that each one applies precisely to his own life. And he goes on to add, why should it not apply to all of you, my disciples as well? And why do you, my disciples, not do likewise by experiencing the sutra with your lives? His inference here is that he alone has experienced the kind of persecution described in the Lotus Sutra. The passages in the midst of the great assembly that constantly try to defame us, and they will address the rulers, high ministers, brahmins, and householders slandering and speaking evil of us, refer to the third and most formidable of the three powerful enemies, arrogant false sages, who are especially difficult to detect. Nichiren employed both reason and actual proof to expose the true nature of Ryokan of Gorakuji Temple, the temple in Kamakura, who is regarded as a living Buddha by the people of the day. In response, Ryokan and his followers spread malicious lies and false rumors about him and incited the authorities to persecute him. This is the perfect example of an arrogant false sage behaving exactly as the Lotus Sutra describes. The sutra also says that evil monks will confront us with foul language and angry frowns again and again. We will be banished, upon which Nichiren comments, I, Nichiren, have been repeatedly driven away and have been twice condemned to exile. And we're almost done, guys. We're not going to be around for 2 weeks, so I'm going to finish. His two exiles to Izu and Sado Island perfectly illustrate that he has read with his very life the sutra passage again and again, we will be banished. In this section, he is in effect proclaiming, my life is unfolded just as the sutra states. I have been persecuted as the sutra predicts, which provides the rightness of my words and actions. Who can deny this, and who among my accusers have embodied the sutra in their lives as I have? His words are a stern repudiation of the persecuting authorities and their cohorts among the priests of the established Buddhist schools. At the same time, they are meant as rousing encouragement for his followers, which includes us, many of whom were confused and troubled by the persecution directed at him and his followers. Here Nichiren concludes this with this very important passage. The Lotus Sutra accords with the fashion of the preaching employed by all the Buddhas of the three existences. The past events described in the never disparaging chapter I am now experiencing as predicted in the encouraging devotion chapter. Thus the present foretold in the encouraging devotion chapter corresponds to the past of the never disparaging chapter. The encouraging devotion chapter of the present will be the never disparaging chapter of the future, and at that time I, Nichiren, will be its bodhisattva never disparaging. The Lotus Sutra teaches, at the top of page 144, second column, the Lotus Sutra teaches that the propagation of the law takes place across the three existences of past, present, and future. Here Nichiren states that the form this propagation takes is to selflessly devote oneself to spreading the mystic law while enduring obstacles and persecution in the evil age of the latter day. Very clearly states that. In this passage, the past of the never disparaging chapter refers to the practice of Shakyamuni in a past lifetime as Bodhisattva never disparaging, as he revealed in the Lotus Sutra that never disparaging was him in the past. The encouraging devotion chapter of the present, meanwhile, refers to Nichiren's courageous and heroic efforts to propagate the Lotus Sutra while battling the three powerful enemies who are described in the encouraging devotion chapter. Nichiren, in other words, is declaring that the past struggle of Bodhisattva never disparaging to show his respect for all people is, in the present latter day, the practice that he, Nichiren, is currently undertaking. Everybody understands? Mm-hmm. Do you understand? Right? He's basically saying, I am the encouraging devotion chapter. He then adds, 13th century Japan, what we're going through right now is the encouraging devotion chapter, which is spoken of as the future in the Lotus Sutra. And the never disparaging chapter is just spoken of as the past, right? Do you understand the correlation that he made? Mm-hmm. That past is really the present, and this present is really going to be the future. He then adds, the encouraging devotion chapter of the present will be the never disparaging chapter of the future, as he indicates when he says, at that time, I, Nichiren, will be its bodhisattva never disparaging. I will be its Shakyamuni Buddha. He is confident that, like bodhisattva never disparaging of the past, he will in the future guide all people to the path of Buddhahood and also attain Buddhahood himself. In the letter from Sato, he writes that since he is making the same cause as Bodhisattva never disparaging, he will undoubtedly be able to gain the same effect of attaining Buddhahood, as Shakyamuni qualified he had as never disparaging in a previous lifetime. Do you understand? Mm-hmm. All right. In short, he seeks to impress on his followers that in the life state of Buddhahood can be attained and manifested in the very midst of battling three powerful enemies. That's when it actually is attained. In the section following this passage, Nichiren writes, in this latter age which corresponds to our own time, the three types of enemies have appeared, explaining that this is the reason why he is striving to propagate the laws of Bodhisattva of the earth in the latter day, just as the Lotus Sutra instructs. And was there anybody that never disparaging didn't save? No. All of them attained Buddhahood after they'd gone through the karma of slandering him. Returning to, this is the next page that would be done. Middle of page 145 in the first column. Returning to the original spirit of faith of Nichiren's time, which is the Soka Gakkai, frankly. Okay? As noted earlier, Nichiren states at the beginning of this letter, I have been prepared for such difficulties from the outset. He seeks to convey to his followers his readiness to forge ahead in his struggle to in exact accord with the Buddha's intent and decree, fully aware of the persecution that awaited him. Fully aware. In another letter, Aspiration for the Buddha Land, written a month later after arriving on Sato Island, he writes, he writes, life is limited. We must not begrudge it. Do not begrudge your life, right? He says that all the time. What we should ultimately aspire is to the Buddha Land. It was a declaration that, come what may, he will keep up his struggle as long as there is a breath in his body, and is also a call for genuine disciples to step forward and carry on his solemn struggle, just like him, with the same conviction as him. Never give up, no matter what. We must never forget that his tireless efforts to propagate the law without begrudging his life were always in complete accord with the Lotus Sutra. That's why Makaguchi practiced that way and went to prison and didn't come out. That's why Toda did the same thing. That's why Ikeda has followed them to accomplish what he's accomplished in his lifetime while we're sitting around this table reading this right now. Return of the original spirit of faith of the Daishonen's Return to the original spirit of faith of the Daishonen's time. This is an everlasting injunction left to us by Mr. Toda. The spirit of Nichiren Daishonin is the eternal Soka Gakkai spirit and the spirit of mentor and disciple, going all the way back to Nichiren. This month, November 20, and I love it when you look at me and smile like that. It makes my day. This month, November 2011, the Soka Gakkai, an organization practicing in exact accord with the Daishonin's teaching, celebrates not only the anniversary of its founding, but also the 20th anniversary of its spiritual independence from the Nichiren Shoshu priesthood. In view of this milestone, it seems appropriate to take a moment to reconfirm the Soka Gakkai's founding spirit, and this will wrap up this lecture. The self-serving Nichiren Shoshu priesthood completely lost sight of the spirit of Nichiren Buddhism, who embarked on a solitary struggle to enable all people to attain enlightenment. The priesthood, ignoring Kosen Rufu and fearful of government pressure under thought control during World War II, enshrined the Shinto talisman, which is like what I told you, what Makaguchi went out there and gave them shit over, which is why he got thrown in prison, right? Because they outed him for having done that. They even actually deleted key passages from Nichiren's writings, such as I, Nichiren, am the foremost sage in all Vipa. And in more recent times, just at the moment when global Kosen Rufu was on the rise, they succumbed to envy and resentment and attempted to divide and conquer the harmonious gathering of the believers of the SGI by creating cut. In the process, they degenerated into a corrupt and heretical sect. And that's what he's calling them all out as being now, which they are. In sharp contrast, SGI members have protected and propagated the mystic law in exact accord with Nichiren's spirit, striving for people's happiness and the realization of world peace. Reading his writings and persevering through their own real life's challenges and problems, all of us, They have been able to demonstrate wonderful actual proof of positively transforming karmic suffering through faith in the mystic law. The Daishonin would surely praise them, and all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas throughout the 10 directions would applaud them. And they do. And they do. Holding high the banner of truth and justice and forging ahead dauntlessly, even in the face of the harshest adversity, this is the spirit of the first three Soka Gakkai presidents, united by the bonds of mentor and disciple in the Soka Gakkai's founding spirit. Mr. Toda said, "You who are presently suffering also possess within you the power to overcome that suffering. And each time we surmount a mountain of tribulation, we strengthen and forge the indestructible state of life of Buddhahood within us. And also in terms of realizing the great ideal of Kosen Rufu, we will make no progress unless we first embark on helping people free themselves from suffering, including that arising from ill health and financial problems. Your individual victories, all of you, based on your Buddhist practice, all of you, ripple out limitlessly to become victories for your families and for Kosen Rufu as a whole. All of you. You affect everybody you freaking know. As the world today faces numerous challenges and problems, a general anxiety about the future and a pervasive sense of deadlock prevail. We all know that. It is precisely at times such as these that the world needs a philosophy capable of revitalizing people's spirits. The great philosophy of Nichiren Buddhism and its teaching of human revolution. Our successors in the Youth Division, in whom I have utmost confidence, will take the lead in spreading this philosophy. I call out to all our members, please advance while letting the spirit that Nichiren Daishonin maintained, the spirit to engage in a great struggle to refute the erroneous and reveal to the true, and to establish the correct teaching for the peace of the land. Permeate your being. Speak out for what is right and set the record straight. G-Man, just what you did. Reach out to others in dialogue to help them find happiness. Strive to expand our movement for global Kosen Rufu, building a strong foundation for world peace. May each of you achieve victory after victory with confidence, composure, and joy, remaining true to the founding spirit of the first three presidents and proud to be a disciple of Nichiren Daishonin. The end of Volume 3 of the Teachings for Victory. We will again, next time, meet after a 2-week break. Get a hold of this if you can. We're going to read at least the first 130 pages to complete the text of this writing. And then we will go on from there to Volume 4. But before we do that, we're going to read the Heritage of the Ultimate Law of Life and Death. Everybody's with me? It's going to be an exciting winter. Winter always turns to spring. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Bye.
Thank you.